So what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue with this question on the menstrual cycle, because if those of you who've looked at past exams, every single year there are questions on the menstrual cycle. So I want to spend a bit of time on it. What I'm going to do is run through the various hormones and basically put these four graphs together. So if we look at the very beginning of the cycle, we can see the following. That, well, they're really, in this case over here, let me rather come over here, it'll make it easier. There should be a slight rise in the level of FSH over here. This is straight from an exam, so the FSH level probably should be a little higher here. Now, why is the pituitary gland releasing an increased level of FSH? So that FSH, follicle-stimulating hormone, can be sent from the pituitary gland in your brain via the bloodstream to the ovary. Why? Because in your ovary is where we have the development of the follicle. We have our diploid cell over there, and what starts happening is that around that diploid cell, which will eventually become the egg, we can see that more and more of these follicle cells are developing. Why are they developing? An increased level of follicle-stimulating hormone will stimulate an increase in the amount of follicle cells. Now, what is the purpose of us increasing the amount of follicle cells? It is because those follicle cells are what produce estrogen. Now, why do we want to increase the production of estrogen? Because as levels of estrogen rise, we see that our endometrium layer inside the uterus starts to thicken. Now, just let me come back to a little bit of this portion of the graph over here. We started over here with an increase in FSH. Our follicles started to develop around the diploid cell over there. But what's important to remember is, even though we say that's the beginning of the cycle, it's the beginning of the cycle because it begins with everything that is going on inside the ovary. But how would a female know that it's the beginning of the cycle? When she starts menstruating. In other words, the endometrium layer, that lining inside the uterus, which has got to get thick and vascular so that it can support a baby. Because remember that the uterus has got to be full of glands and blood vessels so that if a little embryo comes down, it can implant itself in that layer and start to develop and obviously form the placenta. So if she's not pregnant, obviously, well, then she will pass that layer out when she's menstruating. And that's what happens at the beginning of the cycle, is that her endometrium layer gets lost from the month before at the beginning of her cycle over there. And that's why when the follicle cell stimulates the increase in, or follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates the increase in these follicle cells, they will now start producing estrogen. The level of estrogen starts going up, 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 up. And what is the purpose of that? The initial repair of the endometrium layer for this month is caused because of those increases in the estrogen level. Now, if we continue on our graph, we see the follicle cells are developing, estrogen levels are going up, and more or less on about day 12 to 14, we have the development of what is called the Graafian follicle, or Graafian follicle. Lots and lots of follicle cells. Our cell has undergone meiosis 1, so it's already haploid over there. Estrogen levels are going up, so our endometrium layer is getting all nice and thick. But eventually, at around day 13, 14, we have a surge in a hormone from the pituitary gland, namely the hormone LH, or luteinizing hormone. What is the purpose of that surge in LH? Is that hormone is what stimulates ovulation, the release of the egg out of the Graafian follicle on about day 14. Now, what happens from there is as follows. Your Graafian follicle now becomes what is called the corpus luteum. Corpus means body, luteum means yellow, and this yellow body, or corpus luteum, now serves two very important functions. Remember that after ovulation, there might be fertilization. Maybe when the female is ovulated, and remember, her egg will travel from the ovaries into the fallopian tube, and it starts moving along the fallopian tubes towards the uterus. Remember, fertilization of the sperm happens in the fallopian tube, okay? So in those days, while the egg is moving and maybe fertilization occurs, we want to ensure that the endometrium is absolutely thick and vascular and ready for the possible implantation of an embryo. And that's why after ovulation, when our Graafian follicle becomes the corpus luteum, not only do the levels of estrogen remain pretty high, but more importantly, the corpus luteum starts producing very high levels of the hormone progesterone. Why? Because progesterone is the hormone that finishes getting the endometrium layer all nice and thick and vascular in case we have to implant a fetus into that area over there. Now, two things can happen. Remember that if she is pregnant, we must maintain the thick endometrium layer, because if you lose the endometrium layer, she's going to pass out the endometrium layer, and with that, the little fetus will come out. She will miscarry. So therefore, what happens is, if she's pregnant, the corpus luteum will remain intact and functional to keep the levels of both estrogen and progesterone very high. Therefore, the endometrium layer will not break down. Does that make sense? So then she won't menstruate. And therefore the embryo can implant itself and start growing into the fetus and eventually the baby.
So when the fetus gets there, does the layer still get thicker, or does it stop?
Yes, it's normally already as thick as it can possibly be, but it just has to be maintained. Any breaking down of it, and you're going to pass the baby out with it. So, but on the other hand, she might not be pregnant. And therefore, if she's not pregnant, the corpus luteum degenerates. Because the corpus luteum degenerates, the levels of both estrogen and progesterone will drop. Because remember, they're being produced by the corpus luteum. And therefore, if the levels of estrogen and progesterone have dropped, we can't maintain the endometrium layer anymore. And that's why we'll start the cycle again the next month with her menstruating that layer out.
Okay, so looking at the progesterone, does that then mean that if the layers getting thicker, there's more progesterone?
Yes,
does
yes.
that then mean, is this the whole thing of pregnant women's hormones are high?
Correct. That is how women know they're pregnant. Is that when they wee on those pregnancy sticks, is it's measuring in particular the level of progesterone. And that raised level of progesterone, you are pregnant. Which could be wonderful, or it could be an absolute disaster. Depending. Does that make sense?
It makes a whole lot of sense.
Okay, so I wanted to go over that in the beginning because this always comes up, and there are many, or very often there are problems associated with linking these sections together. But now let's look at the questions relating to this. So it says, on which day did ovulation take place? I can clearly see that it's releasing the ovum from the Graafian follicle on day 14. So ovulation took place on day 14. I'm using my resource material. Remember that even if you've done this and you've been told that ovulation happens here or there or whatever else it is, remember that your resource might be different. So please come in and you have your basic knowledge, but you must use your resources. Not everybody ovulates on day 14. All cycles move up and down, whether you're stressed or ill or on pills or anything like that. You know what I mean? So always use your resource because the graph might be different to what you had in your book. Question 2.2 says, 2.2.2.2. Between which days does menstruation take place? I come back to my graph and I can see over here that menstruation took place from there to there, from day 0 to 7. Probably better to say day 1 to 7. Once again, I'm using my resource because many of the books would say it only happens for 3 days or 4 days. You must please use your resource. It's relevant only, the questions are relevant only to this particular case. Okay, next one. State one function of luteinizing hormone, LH. We said that what was the most important function of LH is that a spike in LH caused the Graafian follicle to release the egg, a process that is called ovulation. Our next question, describe the changes in the level of LH shown in the graph. Now, please remember, if it says describe the level in a graph, do not give reasons why. All they are asking you to do is to just discuss what happens in the graph. No reasons why. They might ask for that afterwards. So we can see, if we look at the level of LH, I would say the following, that between day about 1 to sort of 12, 13, the level of LH is very low. From about 13, it goes up. Day 14, it peaks. On about day 15, it drops. And then, of course, remains low for the rest of the cycle. Remember, did you see, I haven't given any information why it does that. I've just been asked to describe the changes, and that's what I've done. I've read the graph, that's all. Okay, 2.2.5, describe the relationship between the level of estrogen and the endometrium from day 7 to day 14. We come to our graph and we can see, go from day 7 to 14, I can clearly see my level of estrogen is rising. What is the relationship? As the level of estrogen rises, so too does our endometrium layer get thicker. Right, we're going to take another